Hi, I'm Eric Brynjolfsson. I'm the director of the MIT Center for Digital Business. Today we're going to talk about the big data revolution. And I have with me Tom Davenport, who helped get that revolution started with his seminal article, Competing on Analytics, that he wrote back, it was about 6 years ago. And he continues to be doing a lot of work in this area and has some interesting insights about how big data is changing management and changing the way business runs. Tom, welcome to the program here.
Thanks, happy to be here.
So let's actually dive right in and start with that seminal article you wrote.
It was seminal, wasn't it?
I think so. A lot of other people thought so too, and I know it's widely read. And you wrote a book around that topic too. You called it Competing with Analytics. Now the buzzword is big data. So what's new? Is this just old wine in new bottles? Have people rebranded something that you've been talking about for years, or is there something different today?
Well, I confess that I initially thought it was old wine in new bottles, and I was tempted to do a global replace of everything I'd ever written about analytics and substitute big data. You know, you can do that with word processors pretty easily. But then I actually did some research on what people were doing in big data, and my skepticism evaporated. I really do think that there's something new going on here, and that it's a different, related but different set of phenomena in many ways. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what a lot of people talk about are the 3 V's of difference. Velocity, variety, and volume. The different ways that data is different now than before, and all those dimensions. If you just look at the numbers, you look at it quantitatively, there have been orders of magnitude changes, partly just because Moore's law is driving so much data. Now, one little statistic we dug up was that there's more data crossing the internet every second than there was in the entire internet back in the 1990s. A company like Walmart processes 2.5 exabytes of data every hour, which is just staggering.
Yeah, no, and those are just the differences in the data itself, but I also found that there are differences in the kinds of people who do this work and in the relative balance of data management related activities and analytics oriented activities, and even in the overall objective. I mean, one thing that I hadn't really thought of before I started talking to a lot of companies about this is that traditional analytics supported internal decisions for the most part and used internal data to do it. Big data is much more likely to be external data, but also it's often to create more desirable products and processes that benefit customers. So LinkedIn, the people you may know, and the jobs you may be interested in, and the groups you may want to join, those are all things created by data scientists with big data out of LinkedIn data, and they make it more appealing to join LinkedIn. So I think there are a lot of examples of where it's not just supporting an internal decision process, which was true for analytics.
Well, you brought up a lot of interesting things there about the different kinds of people, the data scientists and the analysts, internal versus external. But let's dive into that last point that you brought in first, which is what happened at LinkedIn. You wrote a really interesting story about the way there was a data scientist there who really made a huge difference in the success of LinkedIn, and maybe it wouldn't have grown as rapidly as it did over the past few years. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, well, this guy's named Jonathan Goldman, and he is a typical data scientist, I guess, if there is one. He's a physicist by background, and went to work at LinkedIn, was hired by Reid Hoffman, the co-founder, which turned out to be useful to him because he was playing around. He was technically a part of the product team, but Reid Hoffman had said, if you run into any problems, I think this capability is really important, let me know. And so he developed this capability to figure out how some people you might know based on your past, it was initially, I think, fairly primitive algorithm based on your past employment and where you went to school and so on.
Right.
And then you could find out what they're doing now.
I mean, this is for the LinkedIn user. So if I was a LinkedIn user and I had gone to MIT, it might suggest other people who were in my class.
In mechanical engineering or something like that at
Right.
MIT. Yeah. And so he tried this out, and the product people initially were not that enthused. And they said, well, we already have address book lookup. Why would we need this? Which is
Right.
clearly not the same thing. So
Right.
anyway, he went to Reid Hoffman and said, I think this is pretty important. What do you think? And he said, I think it could be really cool. If the product people won't let you put it into the production version of LinkedIn, I'll just give you a little ad. Find out what happened to your classmates or your former colleagues.
So he just ran a little ad next
Yeah.
to the main LinkedIn product. So an ad on his own site.
Yeah, fantastically effective, it turned out, and that got people excited about it, and so they put it into the mainstream system, and now, of course, Facebook has it, and Twitter has it.
This
and
is
so on.
that people you might know box that sometimes pops up. I read in some of your work, actually, I guess it has something like a 30% click-through rate, which is just staggering. I mean,
yeah.
anyone who knows about click-through rates knows that, if you get it into 1/10%, you're probably doing well. So this is a whole different order of magnitude.
And I don't know if they care at LinkedIn about the total time spent on the site, but if you've ever used this capability, the suggestions just keep on coming as you scroll, and so I waste enormous. So who's it going to come up with next? Gee, I forgot about that person. Oh, do I really know that person? Yeah, I guess I do. It's quite uncanny, I think.
Yeah, and so that's a good example of a person with a physics background who's able to go through the numbers, look at the analysis, and create a lot of value on a customer-facing side of the business.
Yeah, and I think it's typical in a variety of ways. One, he is a typical data scientist, this mix of sort of hacking and science backgrounds with a lot of curiosity and given a fair amount of autonomy. But the other thing is, that it's not a terribly, at least initially, I think it's gotten more complex now, it wasn't that complex of an algorithm. And you often find with big data, somebody said to me, big data often equals small math, that you spend so much time manipulating the data and structuring it and so on, getting in the shape where you can do something with it. You don't tend to have a lot of time and energy left to do really complex statistical models.
Not only do you have a lot of time and energy, but I think equally importantly, you don't necessarily have to do a lot of analysis. If you've really structured the data well, often the answer will just pop out, often with a very high degree of precision. This gets to the distinction you were making earlier about the analyst side of a big data scientist versus the computer science or data munging side.
Yeah, hacker.
The hacker side. Exactly. I mean, I have the same experience in some of the work we've done with our teams at MIT. We looked at Google Trends to look at housing market trends. And it was remarkable how once you got the data formatted, which wasn't easy, but once you got it organized, the answers just popped out. You could write the simplest regression model, the simplest statistical model, and outperform these very complicated models that people had been working with when they had much less data. So to some extent, big data sets can be a substitute for a lot of math and analysis.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And another bit of evidence of that is a lot of data scientists and big data people are very enthused about visual analytics and use a lot of visual display tools and so on. And you can't do a lot of complex statistical models in two visual dimensions. So I think that's indicative of the fact that often just counting the stuff is enough.
Yeah, exactly. If you set it up right, a good count of Group A versus Group B. I mean, the classic example is all those online companies that do A/B tests. And if they structure it right, once you're done with the test, you're done. That's the answer. A is better than B.
It's not. Do that thing. Do A.
So it's not a whole lot of analysis. But that actually raises another concern people worry people have about big data is that maybe this is really something that works for those online companies you mentioned, LinkedIn. But what about the other 90% of the economy, the mainstream companies, the brick and mortar companies? Do they have anything to benefit from this revolution, or is this something that they're going to watch and it kind of zips right by them?
Well, I think they do, but they're a little slow to figure it out. I mean, I am almost of the opinion now that every company has the potential to be a big data company. I mean, if you move stuff around in your business, it's pretty clear that self-driving cars and trucks are going to be with us at some point, and Google has said that's just another big data problem.
So how is that a big data problem? Where does the data come from? I mean, so you don't get clickstream data from the cars. So where's the data coming from in these brick and mortar companies?
It's coming from all sorts of bizarre places, from sensors put on every pallet that they might ship around, or
like the RFID sensors.
Yeah, maybe RFID will finally come to fruition after many years.
But even barcode scanning as things are moving around.
GE is one of the most aggressive companies, big companies, in doing things with big data, and every industrial piece of industrial equipment, a locomotive might have 50 sources of big data. I talked to one guy who spent several months trying to, as he put it, suck data out of a locomotive alternator to try to predict when it might break down or best be serviced, which saves a huge amount of money.
These sensors are getting so cheap and so ubiquitous. I mean, it's the Internet of Things kind of story where there's billions or even trillions of sensors that engineers are just putting them all over all the engines and all the other equipment and machinery they make, all the pallets, and so you get a flood of data that you never saw before. And then, of course, you put it into some kind of a system. The rule of thumb that I've heard is that about 5 years after somebody installs an ERP system, they start saying, hey, we need business intelligence, we need big data, because they suddenly realize we've got so much information about our processes that we're not analyzing.
Yeah, I made that number up, actually. No, I didn't make it up. I heard it from an analytics vendor that I do a fair amount of work with, SAS, who the head of sales in Asia Pacific said by country he can sort of tell 5 years after the most companies in that country had put in an ERP system, they call and say, hey, weren't we supposed to do something with all this data that got generated out of that?
Do you think this is having the kind of payoff that people talk about right now? There's a lot of excitement. People are you gave the example of the LinkedIn one, and we can come across dozens of other anecdotes and examples. But does the net of the successes outweigh the failures?
You don't expect that we would actually have any real data on that subject, do you? No. Well, you and I are both interested in the payoffs from analytics, and I know you've done some work in that area. I've done some work in that area. In the big data area, I think it's still pretty early. A lot of the companies are startups. I haven't seen any systematic observation, but I was just the other day compiling on analytics in general. Your work, my work, some other consulting firms that have done some things, and every one of them show a positive correlation of some sort between being more analytical and being financially successful. So I suspect we'll have that at some point for big data.
Yeah, it seems like it's still early days, and it's a lot easier to get the anecdotes. One of the studies that we did with the help of McKinsey and then Lauren Hitt at Wharton and Hee-Kyung Kim and Andrew McAfee here at MIT was we just actually asked a bunch of companies, a few hundred companies, how data-driven they were, how they went about making decisions. And it was about a 20-minute interview, but we got a qualitative sense of whether they're sort of on the data end of the spectrum or more the opinion and judgment end of the spectrum. And then we separately, once we had rated all the firms, we matched them up to another data set on their business performance. And as you were saying, we found a very strong correlation.
6% more productive,
that's right, yeah, you remember it well, exactly. And the ones that were in the top third on being data-driven were about 6% more productive, which was a statistically significant difference. So, of course, in any sample like this, you had examples of successful companies that weren't data-driven and unsuccessful companies that were, but on average, the message was pretty clear.
Yeah, and the companies that I worked with in the early days of competing on analytics all tended to be pretty successful companies. I mean, Capital One, there's a banking crisis, they might have a couple of bad years, but in general, fantastically successful.
Well, they were really a pioneer at driving this thing, and that's a good example of a company that wasn't necessarily an internet company, but one that was very, very data intensive, and they did all those tests with the credit cards. And, I think people have come out of that company and brought that methodology to lots of other areas of
Unfortunately,
retailing.
Also to a number of their competitors. It's a pretty widely adopted approach now.
Sure. Well, that's the way capitalism works,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
What is a data scientist?
Yeah,
First off, it's a term that didn't even exist. I think your co-author coined it just a few years ago.
Yeah, he co-coined the term. I think they were basically trying to get HR off their backs, and so they were asking, what do you guys do? And finally they said, oh, we're data scientists. Okay, we'll put that in the system.
But does it have any content?
Well, it's rapidly losing its content in the sense that everybody I know is saying, oh, yeah, I'm a data scientist. But I think initially, at least, it was this combination of ability to solve business problems, of course, and a lot of curiosity, ability to tell a good story with data, which is something it had in common, those people have in common with traditional analysts, but also these kind of hacking skills, these data manipulation skills, and many times...
now you've got these huge data sets. Yeah. It's not like you can just, load them up on your PC and analyze it.
Using, Hadoop or Pig and Hive, these Python, these scripting languages that people use to manipulate data, and then some analytical skills, and that it seemed like the most common place you would find that combination were computationally oriented scientists, physicists, systems and computational biologists.
They've in the past worked with these very large data sets, whether it's from astrophysics or DNA sequencing.
Yeah, exactly. If it's in the network space, like a LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, I think there's some social scientists who had that kind of background. Unfortunately, there aren't too many people like that in the world, so I think we're going to probably have to move to other types of skills if we're going to be successful.
Well, it's the hot thing. Our friend Hal Varian, what did he say that the sex? What was it that he said?
They're going to statisticians. He was saying are going to be the sexiest job category there is, and now it's data scientists.
Right.
So.
And you buy that, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by sexy. These people, I think, might not meet the traditional, they might not get wolf whistles or anything as they walk down the street.
Sexy in the sense that Bill Gates was sexy in the 1980s.
Exactly. And certainly in demand is one definition of sexy. But as I say, there aren't that many of them, and they're a little quirky to work with in some cases. They have pretty high expectations of the companies they work with. Many of them think that they're changing the world, and they're making a big impact, but they want to keep doing that.
Well, the example you gave at LinkedIn was that he got to work directly with the founder, co-CEO, and that was the kind of influence that they expect to want to have if you want to bring them on board in many cases.
Yeah, one of the ones I interviewed said, I don't know why anybody wants to work with us because we're a real pain in the ass, frankly. He said, we're constantly telling people how bad their data is, and constantly asking for more options, and it's just a pretty demanding group.
But the flip side is that more and more people are starting to call themselves data scientists, even if they don't have that whole skill set. And it's not just the data scientists, but it's the managers who are saying they're data-driven when they really aren't. One of my pet peeves is you go into these companies and they're throwing all these numbers around, bar charts and pie charts, but you drill down a little bit and you realize that the decision was made way before they looked at any of those numbers. It was made the old-fashioned judgment way, and then they sent their minions out to gather the data. So sort of what I'd call pseudo-data-driven.
Well, so maybe we'll have pseudo-big data or pseudo-data science before too long. But I agree. I mean, I think the thing that you really have to have if you're going to be successful with this stuff is an orientation to the scientific method and to seeking out sources of error and trying to find truth. And if you're more interested in how do I use data to further my career, that's the opposite motivation.
No, isn't that nice that if we can bring science to management and economics and social sciences, areas we've been working in for many years, and our colleagues and the hard scientists, never thought of this as being an area that's amenable to it, but it's finally getting there, in part because we finally have something we can measure really carefully in a way we couldn't previously.
Yeah.
We're going to be on hopefully a much faster pace of innovation and discovery, because instead of kind of muddling around, without light, we can now, the analogy I sometimes make is to what happened with the scientific revolution, where finally, once they were able to do the experimental method and measure things much more carefully, you just had a rapidly accelerating pace of discovery. Management hasn't been on that curve until perhaps recently.
No, I think you're right. And I think it will lead to some second-order problems. I was talking to somebody the other day at eBay about all the A/B testing that they do. And it's a really good discipline, and you can find out sort of what works in website design and so on. But they said, it leads to a certain incrementalism that if you're just testing A versus B, you do the one that comes out better by a little bit, and it sort of takes away the creativity and the large-scale innovation that you need to really do step changes. So they're trying to incorporate that into some of their innovation programs.
That's a very good point. Neil Sundararajan, the chief scientist at eBay, and I were talking a bit about this, and exactly as you're saying, they've got a huge data set. And it's very easy to make incremental A/B tests where you have the shopping cart on the left or the right, or the color is different. That's the easiest thing in the world to do. But if you want to make a fundamental strategic change, that's not the kind of thing you can just A/B test your entire company on.
So we still need humans for some things
for some parts of it. Yeah. So maybe we'll see faster improvement in those incremental things, but the big leaps, the kind of things like Steve Jobs was famous for, and others, and sort of really fundamentally rethinking without listening to customers as much. That isn't something that's been automated or even close
exactly.
to it. What are some of the pitfalls that you see, what are some of the dangers, the risks that you see with big data? I mean, obviously, there are these huge opportunities. We talked about the money that can be made, the potential for innovation. Are there things that managers should be worrying about?
It still has to have some business value, some business purpose. I think there's a tendency with big data to say, well, let's just gather a lot of data and surely we'll find something in there. It's got got to be a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow somewhere. But I still think, while you want a spirit of experimentation and exploration, you still need to have some sort of sense of how's this going to move the needle from a business standpoint. What's my primary target for my big data and analytical activities? And that, I think, is shared with traditional analytics.
So this isn't the kind of thing where you can just sort of turn the decision-making over to a group of data scientists and say, okay, come back in 2 months and tell us what the answer is?
I think that would be risky. You might get lucky, but I think you'd be much more successful if you gave them a little more business direction.
Yeah, so it's that combination of having some domain knowledge, some business direction, as well as the ability to work with the data.
Yeah, exactly.
The guys at Kaggle I was talking to a bit, and the thing that really sort of surprised me was how often the winners of those contests ended up being from a very different domain, however. So you know Kaggle, it's this marketplace really where they have contests to come up with a better way of rating cars for insurance or other categories. A customer will give them the data, and then they'll open it up to data scientists from all over the world, from lots of different disciplines, and sometimes in the course of 30 or 60 days, come up with a much better solution to the client's problem.
I didn't really realize that they were doing these kind of private competitions, and that they were increasingly viewing this as a way to get data science capabilities for an organization. But I think at the time they told me that one of their leading data scientists was an actuary, which no offense to actuaries, but I was surprised.
It's the sexy profession of the next decade, right?
Typically, I think of them as being good at calculating insurance life tables, but not doing really creative problem solving. So maybe I was wrong about them all these years. But I think people can come in from outside of a problem area and often see some new things.
Some fresh perspective. People have picked over the old methods, and sometimes there's some whole new approach. And that's why it's nice to have this community. That's one of the nice things that the internet and the web world can do is bring together people from multiple continents to work on a problem like that. Another set of risks that I'm increasingly concerned about, I don't know if you agree, is around privacy and security. When you get these very large data sets, it starts the potential to be, A, very intrusive about people's personal lives, and B, if there's health or financial information that's being passed around, that also presents a serious security risk.
I worried about this for a while, and then I came to believe that there is no way that our legislators are going to keep up with the capabilities of the technologists to learn from the data. So in a way, I am a little bit despairing of, as you know, if you have enough data, you can, no matter how much you anonymize it, you can pretty much figure out who the individual is.
Right, there have been these classic examples where a company like AOL will turn over a quote-unquote anonymized data set to a group of computer scientists and data scientists, and shortly thereafter they'll reverse engineer it and figure out who all the individuals are in it.
And Netflix canceled the second version of the Netflix prize for that very reason. So I just, while I am worried about it, I'm increasingly coming to the point of view of Scott McNealy when he was CEO of Sun Microsystems, who said, you don't have any privacy, just get over it.
Right. So it's not that it's not a problem, but it's that you don't see a solution, so why bother?
Well, I don't. I'm hoping there's some smart people at MIT who are working on one, but
there are people. Sandy Pentland has got a little project where he's trying to come up with a data ownership system, but I'm with you. At this point, I don't see a solution that emerging very clearly. What about the security side? That's another one that I think companies, they're worried about, but my sense is they're not worried enough.
I think that's probably true, and you have to be a little nervous if we're encouraging this new profession that's kind of half hacker, and they're going to get a lot of access to databases, and they don't necessarily all feel a lot of loyalty to your particular business, I think I would be quite nervous about the
But
security
they
and
themselves,
privacy implications.
Yeah, and then there's a whole bunch of black hat hackers who are out there trying to break in. And after spending a little time with the security folks and them showing us all the flaws in most systems out there, I just came away thinking it's inevitable. There's going to be a huge data breach, a huge security crisis, even bigger than the ones we've seen. And I don't see any way of people taking it seriously until after that crisis rather than before.
Yeah. So are you advising that we take our money out of banks and put it in our mattresses, or?
I don't know. I actually, I am a little bit worried about it. I'm just hoping that, we'll have some kind of a response that recovers. But our financial systems are not nearly as secure as they should be. And as more and more things get data intensive, the potential just opens up more and more.
Yeah. I guess that would argue for, we used to argue for diversification of assets in a financial management sense because assets moved up and down at different rates and so on. Now it turns out the assets are no longer a reason for spreading your money around, but maybe the security issue would be.
That's interesting. That gets to Sandy Pentland's analogy, where he treats information as an asset and is trying to apply some of the things we've thought about for financial assets to information and privacy. And diversification does come to mind as one of the things maybe we should be thinking about. But it's a very new world. It was going to require a new set of thinking. I want to get some advice from you. You're perhaps the leading thinker in this area, and certainly the person that people are turning to for advice. What should managers be doing, going forward, either in the short term or the medium term, if they want to be successful using big data?
I wouldn't necessarily advise that you jump in head first if you're, a typical industrial or financial company, but I think you need to be experimenting. You need to be thinking about what data assets do you have already, what external assets might be relevant to your business. If you don't feel like you can compete in the very tough market for hiring data scientists, you can hire consultants to work with you a little bit, or do a Kaggle competition or something along those lines to just get a foot, more than a toe maybe, into the water and say, this is probably going to be key to our future capabilities. What can we do now to kind of give us a head start in this regard? And be very careful if somebody else in your industry or in an adjacent industry is moving a lot faster than you are. I was talking to some R&D person in one of the big automobile companies, and I said, what are you thinking about this self-driving car? And he said, well, we're going to let Google do the experimentation there. And it seemed like a really bad idea to me, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, they've already made quite a bit of progress, and I was out there. I got to ride in the Google self-driving car, which is kind of fun, cruising down Route 101. And I won't tell you the logo.
You live to tell the tale.
I live to tell the tale. Actually, afterwards, when I came back to Boston and took the taxi ride from Logan,
you were more scared than that.
I did. That's exactly. I was like, boy, I wish this were a Google car. I would have been feeling a lot safer than the taxi driver I got from the pool. But I won't tell you the logo on the Google car that I drove around. But there's obviously some major manufacturers that already are working with them, and that's a good example of companies that are racing ahead with certain technologies that are happening a lot faster than I anticipated just even a few years ago.
Yeah, if you compete with GE, and there are a lot of companies that compete with GE, you'd be aware they're talking about spending a couple of $2 billion on software and big data. So you might want to think carefully about not doing anything.
Not a lot of companies will have a couple $1 billion they can spend, but I guess if they can pick off a vertical area that they can go after. Yeah, and of course there are courses and programs. So Sandy Pentland and I are teaching a course at MIT on big data. It's a 2-day executive course, and we've been overwhelmed by the demand for that course. It's, according to the Exec Ed program, the most popular course that they've had so far in terms of the waiting list. Other advice going forward that people should be thinking about as they move into this area?
Well, I think the issues that we raised before, start thinking much more carefully about privacy and security issues, because you could get into some very embarrassing situations that affect your customers in a negative way.
Right.
And, start factoring this into your strategic planning a little
Right.
bit. How does it relate to your future products and service
Right.
offerings? How could big data make them more attractive to your
Yeah.
customers?
A lot of people think that, they think first of the technology, these exotic technologies like Hadoop and the very large data centers, that putting stuff in the cloud with Cloudera or Amazon's EC2. Is that the thing that they should be focusing on right now, or is that something not to worry about?
Not the business people, I would say, because there will be, I think, rapid progress in that area as well. Hadoop, despite all the enthusiasm, I gather, I'm not a technologist, it does some things pretty well, but there will be a lot of other tools that come along over the next several years, and that problem will be much easier to solve than the creativity about how does it fit your business model and how does it change your organization and how do you find the people. Right now I think the big constraining factor is the people who can do this stuff. The data is everywhere. A lot of the software is open source. The people are not open source at all.
That's exactly what we're seeing when we talk to companies as well. One of the great things is how remarkably cheap much of this technology is. Either it's open source or you do things in the cloud. You can ramp them up a la carte as you need more or less. And so that part has become far easier than you might have expected. As usual in these kinds of management revolutions, it's the cultural change, it's the leadership issues that end up being a lot harder. The mentality that most managers have, they've been brought up with that, hey, I've got to project a sense of confidence that, hey, I know the answer even when I don't really. And that's exactly the wrong kind of mindset for a data-driven world, where you have to project the even greater level of confidence that, hey, I don't know the answer, and I'm willing to turn to the data, and I'm willing to admit to my colleagues, to my subordinates, that I'm not coming here with all the answers, but we have a methodology for getting the data to speak and asking the right questions rather than blustering ahead with what we thought was the right answer.
Yeah, and really important, I think, to admit when you're wrong and to become sort of, as an organization, students of the errors that you make. It's worked out very well in the healthcare organizations that have started admitting that they make errors, they get sued less, they improve faster. I think that's
evidence-based decision-making in medicine has been a real revolution, and the openness that hospitals now have to say, hey, let's go back and figure out which cases went well and which ones didn't go well and learn from that rather than trying to paper over it. So Tom, with all these companies trying different things, how does a company know if they're doing it right?
Well, I think there are some traditional criteria. We don't want to get into the situation we did in the .com boom where people would say, well, we don't need to make money. We have eyeballs,
So we got bits.
Yeah. So I think it's, are you actually coming out with a useful product feature or at least a demo that might have promise? Are you getting more customers as a result of this? Are you making better decisions? If I'm a VC funding a company like this, it's the same criteria. What's the business model that's actually going to make money? Because I think we might easily get overly enamored of the idea of big data and forget about those traditional criteria.
Sure. It's so easy. When you have so much data, you can go and you can muck around, and you can find all sorts of correlations and things that are related to each other. That's where the business manager really has to come in and say, look, the goal is to move the dial over here on this performance metric. That's what we're about. We're not about finding other interesting, intellectually curious correlations. And so by asking the right questions and by pointing people towards some kind of measurable performance metric, then you can make progress towards that. And it's been remarkable to me how successful a lot of data scientists have been once you point them in that direction to move that dial often a lot more than I would have anticipated.
Yeah, and they want to make a difference to the business. As DJ Patil says, we want to be on the bridge, advising the captain on what way to go from a business perspective as well as a data science perspective.
Yeah, what was the line you used in your recent article about that consultants are the dead zone? Or
being a consultant is the dead zone because all they do is produce a report or a PowerPoint presentation. That's not enough. We want to have an
real data scientist, the kind of data scientist you want to hire, is the one who wants to change the world, make a difference to the business. But nonetheless, there's a power shift going on, isn't there, in these businesses? A change in terms of where the knowledge and ultimately where the authority for decision making resides.
Well, I think there is. It's interesting. When I was talking to these data scientists, one question I had for them is, how do you relate to the CIO in your organization? And a lot of them weren't sure what I even meant by that term. They said, "Oh, you mean those people who run the general ledger system or whatever?" But they said, "You know, we report to the head of product or the CEO or."
So they surely go around the whole information systems organization.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think the CIOs of the world are going to have to work hard to catch up and get any responsibility for this type of thing, because they're viewed in many cases more as an obstacle to supplying data than a facilitator of the process.
Well, it gets to what we were talking about before, that a lot of these technologies are actually open source, lightweight things. If you got a product marketing manager, they may be able to pull together some of these cloud-based, Hadoop-based solutions without going through the traditional information systems organization.
Yeah, and you know, the worst possible situation for them would be if in a couple of years, the data scientists had moved on to new things, and they said, "Here, you take this thing and try to make it a production."
Yeah, throw it over the wall.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's all messy spaghetti code.
Exactly. Nobody wants that.
Yeah, no, we've all seen that happen a lot of times. But also, that's in the technical side, but also on the management side, I mean, I'm seeing a transformation. There's this funny term that I'm sure you've heard, HIPPOs, the highest paid person's opinion. And I think that captures very well the way a lot of decisions have been made traditionally. Before the big data era, before the analytics era, people relied on their gut, their instincts, and when an important decision was made, they'd get around a table and everyone would throw in their opinions, and when they were done, they would go with the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. Now that highest paid person's opinion has a real serious rival, namely data.
Yeah. No, I see that a lot at EMC, which is a company that's, you know, in our backyard in the Boston suburbs, and historically a very hierarchical company, even though it's a data storage company, one driven by power and politics and ego and so on. And now you can start to tell the people who are really prospering, this guy Dave Goulden, who's named the new president, he was always the numbers guy, the one who brought lots of data with him to meetings. They're having a course for all senior managers on how to understand and interpret data. So definitely things are changing in organizations, and you can't get by with a gut anymore.
Well, it's a culture shock. And one of the reasons that these online companies have been doing it so much more rapidly is because they didn't have an old organization that they had to change. They were born digital. But it's good to know there are companies, you mentioned EMC. Our friend Gary Loveman at Caesars has done a tremendous job changing the culture there. He says he had to change a lot of the management, half the management over time to make that happen. But he put in place a culture which was, you know, not what do you think, but what do you know? Bring me the data. Show me the evidence.
Right. Well, we described him as a Harvard guy or an MIT guy. He taught at Harvard, but I guess he was trained at MIT.
Yeah, then exactly. He spent a little stint over there at Harvard, but ultimately, he was actually a classmate of mine when we were both in the PhD program.
Oh,
here.
Funny. Yeah, he has been a good role model, and I think they should take more academics and make them CEOs of big companies. Don't you think?
No. You and I know that Gary's unique, and we know enough academics that 9 times out of 10 that's not going to work. Well, Tom, it's been a delight talking about these issues with you. It's really fun to be here at the cusp of a revolution and watching it unfold, but also helping to make it unfold. So thanks very much for sharing some of your thoughts with us today and joining us here with the Sloan Management Review audience.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.